The morning light filtered softly through the tall windows of the Ashland County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Jasmine Crockett paused just inside the heavy oak doors, taking a moment to steady herself. The courtroom was already filling up. Curious onlookers, local reporters, and a handful of supporters had come to witness what had become more than just a trial. It was a test of courage, a quiet rebellion against a system too often deaf to pain and too slow to justice. Jasmine's eyes swept the room, briefly resting on the jury, then drifting to the judge's bench where Judge Driscoll sat, his expression unreadable beneath the heavy eyebrows that shadowed his eyes. His robe was immaculate, the symbol of his authority in this small town, but there was something rigid about him, as if every case, every word spoken here was carefully measured against the weight of his own standards. At her neck hung a simple gold cross, delicate yet unmistakable against the crisp white collar of her blouse. To some, it was just a necklace. To Jasmine, it was a legacy, a token of strength passed down from her grandmother, who had worn it through the harshest years of segregation, from her mother, who had carried it into the fight for voting rights, and now, from her own neck, a reminder that every step forward in justice was a step carried on the shoulders of those before her. But today, that necklace had become a battleground. As Jasmine took her seat at the defense table, the courtroom suddenly seemed to hold its breath. The murmurs quieted. Judge Driscoll's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Miss Crockett," he said with clipped authority, "you are hereby fined $200 for wearing that necklace in this courtroom." The words hung there, unexpected, as a few spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Murmurs began to swell. What was the reason? What rule had been broken? Jasmine's eyes met the judge's, steady and unyielding. She rose slowly, the subtle glint of the cross catching the light. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm but firm, "if a simple necklace threatens the court's impartiality, then perhaps the fear is not of the symbol itself, but of what it represents." A hush fell over the room. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes narrowing briefly before he gave a slight nod and moved on, the fine still hanging over her like a shadow. Jasmine sat back down, her fingers lightly touching the necklace. It was more than a piece of jewelry, it was a quiet act of defiance, a reminder of the courage to stand firm even when the rules seemed designed to silence. The trial resumed. Jasmine's client, Cecil Monroe, sat across from her, a man weathered by life, yet dignified in the face of the injustice he'd endured. The case was simple on paper. Monroe had been subjected to excessive force by correctional officers during his time in custody. But it was more than just a case of physical injury. It was about the system's tendency to overlook the humanity of those it held responsible for. Jasmine's voice carried through the courtroom as she methodically laid out her argument, carefully weaving legal precedents with human stories. She called up the case of Hope v. Pelzer, 2002, a landmark Supreme Court decision where a prison guard was found to have violated the Eighth Amendment by using cruel and unusual punishment, even though the method wasn't standard procedure. "It's not the rule book we must follow," Jasmine said, "it's the bar we set for humanity." Then she brought up Hudson v. McMillian, 1992, where the court ruled that the use of excessive force could be unconstitutional even when injuries were not severe, emphasizing intent over the physical damage. "Brutality doesn't require broken bones," she told the jury, "just the willful choice to inflict pain." Throughout her presentation, Jasmine held the room. Her tone was neither angry nor pleading, but precise, controlled, a lawyer's voice shaped by years of study and personal history alike. Her cross caught the light again as she gestured toward the screen, reminding everyone silently that the courtroom was not just a place of law, but a place where truth should stand unshaken. Judge Driscoll watched her carefully, his fingers steepled in front of him, his expression unreadable. When the prosecution's attorney, Mr. Sturgis, objected, calling her words a sermon, the judge's dismissal was sharp but fair. "Sit down, Mr. Sturgis," he said without looking up. It was the first time Jasmine noticed irritation in his voice. But she didn't back down. She knew this was bigger than the case. This was about the court itself, about its willingness to face uncomfortable truths rather than hide behind procedure. The courtroom was still as she finished. The jury, the spectators, Even the judge seemed to be holding their breath. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, the judge called a brief recess. Jasmine gathered her notes slowly, eyes still distant. Cecil Monroe gave her a faint nod, gratitude unspoken but palpable. Cecil had carried the weight of this fight for years, and Jasmine felt the enormity of what was at stake, not just for him, but for every person who had ever been silenced or dismissed. As she stood to leave, Jasmine caught the judge's eye again. For the first time, there was a flicker of respect there, though the fine remained on the record. She stepped outside the courtroom into the bustling hallways of the courthouse, the weight of the day pressing against her. But with every step, the cross at her neck seemed to grow heavier, not with burden, but with the promise of what was yet to come. The courtroom emptied slowly, the chatter of whispers and shuffled papers filling the air as the jurors returned to deliberate. Jasmine sat back down, folding her hands calmly on the polished wood of the defense table. Her gaze was steady but far away, already tracing paths beyond the walls of this courtroom. Beside her, Cecil Monroe sat quietly, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm against the leather of his worn jacket. Years of pain, frustration, and quiet endurance had settled into the lines on his face, but today there was a spark, a fragile hope that perhaps justice might finally tilt in his favor. The gallery, once bustling with anticipation, grew still. Even Judge Driscoll seemed to lean back in his chair, folding his hands as if preparing himself for the outcome he might not expect. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Jasmine's mind wandered, not away from the case, but through the corridors of every courtroom she'd ever entered, every injustice she'd fought against. She thought of her grandmother, who had endured worse than this without losing her quiet dignity, of her mother, who had marched through streets filled with shouting and hatred, always holding her head high, and of herself, standing here now, carrying their legacy not just in her heart but on her skin, in the glint of gold resting against her collarbone. When the jury foreperson finally stood, the room fell silent again. The weight of their decision was palpable. Judge Driscoll took the sealed envelope, his fingers tightening slightly around the paper as he read the verdict in a voice low but clear. In the matter of Monroe versus Ashland Correctional, on the count of use of excessive force in violation of the Eighth Amendment, we find in favor of the plaintiff. We award damages in the amount of $285,000. A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. Some gasps were quiet but genuine, surprise that the system, in this case, had tilted towards justice. Whispered remarks floated in the air. "They actually did it," one spectator murmured, disbelief and relief mingling in the words. Cecil Monroe's face remained calm, but inside, something shifted. Layers of decades-old pain, frustration, and fear began to peel away, as if the verdict had unlocked a door long sealed shut. Jasmine caught his eye and offered a brief squeeze of his arm, no words needed between them. Judge Driscoll's gavel struck the bench, sharp and final. "Court is adjourned." But before the crowd could disperse, the judge called out, "Miss Crockett, a word please." The doors opened behind her, letting in a flood of light and the murmurs of those eager to leave, but Jasmine turned back towards the bench. Reporters pressed forward, cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward her, but she walked calmly, deliberately, the cross around her neck a quiet emblem of resolve. Judge Driscoll, now without his robe, stood close to the clerk's table. His tone was low, meant only for her ears. "I reviewed the fine I issued this morning," he said quietly. Jasmine said nothing, waiting. He sighed, a sound that carried more weight than his words. "I was wrong. It wasn't about the cross, it was about control. I didn't expect to be challenged, especially not by someone who came in as an observer." She tilted her head slightly as if to say, "And yet, here we are." Driscoll continued, "I'm striking the fine from the record and have signed the dismissal." The quiet admission hung between them like a fragile truce. "Thank you," Jasmine said simply. He nodded once, a mixture of apology and grudging respect in his eyes. "You were the sharpest lawyer in the room today, even when you weren't supposed to be in it." Jasmine allowed herself a soft smile. "I didn't come here to prove anything," she said. "That's what made it work," Driscoll replied. As she turned to leave, he stopped her with one last question, his voice gentler now. "How long have you had that necklace?" "Since I passed the bar," she answered, "but I've worn it longer." He nodded again, a silent acknowledgement of the history and strength woven into that simple piece of jewelry. Outside the courthouse, the sun was bright and sharp against the brick facade. Reporters clustered near the steps, their questions already mounting. Jasmine walked alone, no entourage, no aides, just a woman with a notebook tucked under her arm and the cross gleaming quietly against her chest. The microphones rose as she approached. "Congresswoman Crockett, did you expect to win today? Will you be taking on more legal cases? Was the fine really about the necklace or about who you are?" Jasmine raised a calm hand, cutting through the noise. "I came here today in a personal capacity," she said. "And I ended up stepping into something that mattered deeply, not because I planned to, but because someone needed help." She paused, eyes steady. The court ruled in his favor. That's what justice looks like. When asked about Judge Driscoll's fine, Jasmine paused briefly before replying, "Let's just say we had a respectful conversation." A fine was issued and later withdrawn. But then, with quiet conviction, she added, "Sometimes people confuse authority with correctness. Being in charge doesn't mean you're always right. But being willing to change your mind, that's leadership." The words echoed as she moved down the courthouse steps, the cameras following her every move. No rush, no retreat, just steady, deliberate steps away from the courtroom and into the wider world where her fight was far from over. The courtroom was slowly emptying, the weight of the verdict still settling in the air like a tangible presence. Jasmine Crockett stood quietly at her seat, a soft but resolute calm framing her face as the buzz of murmurs echoed off the walls. The jury, already dismissed, filed out with subtle glances of relief and satisfaction. The judge, Judge Driscoll, sat back in his chair, eyes fixed for a long moment on the empty jury box, as if contemplating the magnitude of what had just transpired. Then the moment came. Judge Driscoll called out quietly, "Miss Crockett, a word, please." The courtroom doors slid open, and the crowd's momentum shifted, many turning their heads, expecting Jasmine to join the flow of people. But she did not. Instead, she remained still, gathering her notes with deliberate calm, and walked slowly toward the bench. The press, sensing something, tried to catch a glimpse, a soundbite, an angle, but Jasmine was steady, unhurried. Stopping a few feet from the judge, who had stepped down from the bench and was now standing beside the clerk's table, she met his eyes. There was no anger or resentment in either of their gazes, just a complicated understanding forged in the heat of the trial. "I reviewed the fine I issued this morning," Judge Driscoll began quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I was wrong." Jasmine said nothing, simply nodded, allowing him to continue. "It wasn't about the cross," he admitted. "It was about control. I didn't expect to be challenged. Especially not by someone who came in as an observer." She tilted her head slightly, a subtle invitation to speak more. Driscoll sighed, a mixture of frustration and reluctant respect. "I'm striking the fine from the record. I've signed the dismissal." A soft "thank you" escaped from Jasmine's lips. The judge's tone softened further, almost admiring. "You were the sharpest lawyer in the room today. Even when you weren't supposed to be in it." Jasmine allowed herself a small smile, one that carried the weight of years of persistence. "I didn't come here to prove anything," she said simply. "That's what made it work," Driscoll replied. Jasmine turned to leave, the quiet confidence in her steps a stark contrast to the noise of the departing courtroom. But before she could reach the door, the judge called her again. "How long have you had that necklace?" She paused, her hand instinctively brushing the gold cross resting against her collarbone. "Since I passed the bar," she answered. He nodded thoughtfully. "I've worn mine longer." She didn't respond, simply left the courtroom without looking back. Outside, the cameras were waiting, flashing relentlessly as reporters clamored to get a statement. But Jasmine moved with purpose, unbothered by the sudden glare of attention. She didn't bring an entourage, didn't offer soundbites crafted for the press. Just a woman in a black blazer, a notebook tucked under one arm, and a gold cross shining above her heart, visible, untouchable. Congresswoman Crockett. A reporter called, stepping forward, microphone extended. Did you expect to win today? Will you take on more cases like this? Was the judge's fine really about the necklace or about who you are? Jasmine raised a calm, firm hand to pause the flood of questions. I came here in a personal capacity today, she said measuredly. But I found myself stepping into something that mattered deeply, not because I planned to, but because someone needed help. The court ruled in his favor. That's what justice looks like. The question about the fine lingered in the air. She paused, thoughtful, then said, let's just say we had a respectful conversation. A fine was issued and later withdrawn. The reporters scribbled, eyes wide, expecting no more. But Jasmine pressed on, voice steady, imbued with quiet power. Sometimes people confuse authority with correctness, she said. Being in charge doesn't mean you're always right. But being willing to change your mind, that's leadership. Her words hit like a ripple in the pond, destined for the headlines before the day was done. She walked down the courthouse steps, cameras trailing her, reporters vying to follow. Yet she didn't speed up or look back. She moved at her own pace, turning sharply into a small side doorway, disappearing from sight. Moments later, Judge Driscoll stepped out too. No robe, no crowd, just the judge and a legal assistant. A reporter spotted him, quick to seize the moment. Judge, any comment about today's ruling? Driscoll hesitated briefly, then looked straight at the camera. I was reminded today, he said quietly, that brilliance doesn't always announce itself with titles or robes. Sometimes it just walks in, sits down, and waits for the moment to speak. The reporter blinked. Are you referring to Miss Crockett? He nodded. I am. And the fine? He exhaled slowly. It was never about the jewelry. That necklace didn't challenge the court. My assumption did. He walked away, leaving the reporter momentarily speechless. Down the street, Jasmine was already gone, vanished into a small bookstore tucked on the corner of Commerce and Griffin. No press. No fanfare. Just her and a little quiet inside. She bought one thing, a used copy of Gideon's Trumpet. The cashier, eyes curious, asked, Are you the lady from the courthouse today? Jasmine smiled gently. Just someone who loves the Constitution. Meanwhile, back at the newsroom, editors scrambled to shape the story. Some went for flashy headlines. Congresswoman saves civil rights case after courtroom twist. Others focused on the symbol, gold cross, silver tongue, the day Crockett took the courtroom. One outlet, however, hit closer to the truth. Crockett doesn't wear power, she wields it. But the real story wasn't the necklace, or even the legal win. It was how Jasmine had held the room, uninvited, unwelcome at first, yet utterly unshaken. In the days that followed, the video of her closing argument, grainy, raw footage leaked by someone in the back row, went viral. Her hand lightly touching the cross, her voice measured and unshaken. If you're afraid of a necklace, maybe it's not the symbol that's threatening. The clip spread fast. YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, becoming a rallying cry for those who felt dismissed or silenced. In Phoenix, a teacher played it in her 11th grade civics class, sparking the first student in months to raise his hand, eyes wide. Wait, can judges really do that? In Kansas, a Vietnam veteran named Cecil shared it with a simple caption, "We fought for this." In Milwaukee, a pastor used the clip during Bible study, declaring, "That's what it looks like to walk into fire with grace." The debate roared on. Should courts ban religious symbols? Was the judge biased? Had Jasmine been treated unfairly? But the loudest voices were not pundits or politicians. They were ordinary people, those who had been fined for wearing the wrong thing, silenced for speaking too soon, told they didn't belong in certain rooms. They saw themselves in Jasmine, in her control, her refusal to shout, her deep knowledge of a system that so often chews people up quietly, leaving no bruise. Cecil Monroe, the man at the center of the case, gave one interview sitting on his daughter's porch, clutching the verdict papers. "She didn't even know me," he said softly, "but she knew this system. And she didn't let it walk all over me, just 'cause it could." Lauren Gates, the co-counsel, sent a public statement thanking Jasmine for stepping in, and privately offered to collaborate on another pending civil rights case. As for Jasmine, she returned to Congress the next week. Committee hearings, briefings, long floor votes, everything as usual. She didn't change her routine, didn't make a speech, didn't tweet. But the necklace stayed on. Every day, every meeting, every session. One journalist cornered her in the Capitol hallway and asked, "Has that cross become a symbol of defiance?" Jasmine looked at him, calm and clear. "It's not defiance," she said. "It's memory. My grandmother wore it when they said she couldn't learn. My mother wore it when they said she couldn't vote. I wear it because they told me I didn't belong in certain rooms." She smiled, a quiet but fierce declaration. "And then I walked in anyway." That quote hit the front pages of 3 newspapers. It reached beyond politics, to people who'd been fined for their beliefs, silenced for speaking up, dismissed for their appearance. It reminded everyone that the law isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who knows how to speak when it matters most. And sometimes, power doesn't shout. Sometimes, it just sits quietly in the front row, waiting for its name to be called.